Now it is time to talk about block ciphers. Block ciphers operate on b-bit blocks of data. So this is why actually we call them a block cipher. So it doesn't matter the size of your data. It can be a few bytes, or it can be a file in your computer that take like 2 terabytes. It doesn't matter. When you want to use a block cipher, the input size is not that matter, because we are designing the algorithm so that it works on a fixed size data. So in this case, nowadays we are using block size as 64 or 128 bits. So it is like 8 bytes or 16 bytes, depending on the block cipher you are working on. So in other words, actually you are encrypting 8 character or 16 character at a time. So you might think that why there's such a design. It actually, we have to go back to the history of the ciphers to understand that. Again, we don't have time for detailed historical introduction in this course, but let me try to explain it in a few sentences. Historical ciphers worked on letters, so you were using pen and paper to most of the time substitute the letter with another one. But it turned out that this can be broken by frequency analysis. So people thought that maybe if we substitute 2 letters with 2 letters, then we can have more security. Yes, you can, but it can still be broken by frequency analysis, which uses actually the redundancy in the language. So at some point, people realized that if the size of the letters are big, then we can actually have security. But substituting huge blocks of letters with huge blocks of letters is not easy to do with pen and paper. So this is why actually those pen and paper substitution methods lead to the idea of block ciphers. So block ciphers are designed in this way. The block size can be like 64 bits or 128 bits. So the input and output size are the same. So again, you're encrypting block by block. If you want to encrypt a 1 gigabyte of file, you have to divide it into blocks, then perform the encryption operation on all of the blocks. And actually, how you combine these blocks depends on the mode of operation that you are going to choose. And there are some secure mode of operations, and there are some broken ones. So in the following week, I will talk about which mode of operations are secure and which are kind of standardized by NIST and so on. So we will see them later. So for the rest of this talk, just assume that we are trying to encrypt b-bits data. So we are only focusing on a single block. So plaintext is divided into b-bit blocks. Each block is encrypted by a secret key K to produce a b-bit output. The secret K nowadays has the size of 128 bits or 192 bits or 256 bits. So current technology cannot break any of these. But in the future, when we have better technology, maybe hundreds of years later, this might be broken, or with a huge technological advancement, it can be broken decades later. So for this reason, for military-grade security, it is advised that people choose the key size like this. But for personal use, today, this size is enough. Current technology is not enough to perform brute force attacks for key sizes of this length. And I will try to explain it in this lecture about what is the computational power of today's CPUs or GPUs or FPGAs and so on. So, but one warning should be that there are some algorithm standards, which are ISO standards that support 80-bit secret keys, but I'm completely against them because it is becoming easier and easier to perform brute force attacks on this kind of short keys due to the technological advancement in FPGAs, and also if you build a dedicated device for this kind of attacks, it might be practical to perform to capture 80-bit secret key. So for me, anything shorter than this is not secure. So let's go back to our definition. We said that the input and output size are fixed, that are b-bit blocks. So as an input, you can have, since we are talking about bits, you can have 2 to the b different input, and you are mapping them to 2 to the b outputs. So the input space and the output space are the same, but which element is mapped to the which one is actually determined by your secret key in this kind of ciphers. So your secret key and the block cipher algorithm you choose actually acts like a permutation, and changing the key also changes this permutation and so on. So idea is to design such a good cipher so that any key you choose turns this into a random permutation, so that by looking at the ciphertext blocks, it will be impossible to guess what the input blocks were. So a good block cipher should provide that. So now let's move on to block cipher design principles. Again, we don't have much time for this topic, so I will briefly mention what is the main idea behind it. For this reason, let's talk about Claude Shannon for a second. He is considered as the father of information theory. He contributed to the field of cryptanalysis for USA defense during the Second World War. His landmark paper, Communication Theory of Secrecy Systems, dated 1949, introduced the twin ideas of confusion and diffusion for practical cipher design. So let's give the definition from him. So the confusion is the idea behind confusion is as follows. It is to make the relation between the simple statistics of the ciphertext and the simple description of the key a very complex and involved one. And for the diffusion, the statistical structure of the plaintext which leads to its redundancy is dissipated into long-range statistics in the cryptogram. So these, as you can see, these are not absolute concepts. These concepts are not measurable. So we are trying to actually, when we are designing a block cipher, we are trying to find a mathematical reasoning for the choices we are doing for confusion and diffusion. So I think Massey gave easier to understand definitions for this, for confusion. The ciphertext statistics should depend on the plaintext statistics in a manner too complicated to be exploited by the cryptanalyst. And for diffusion, each digit of the plaintext and each digit of the secret key should influence many digits of the ciphertext. So these definitions are a little bit easier to understand. So by diffusion, we want to make the cipher so that making any small changes in the plaintext or the key should almost affect the whole ciphertext bit. So this is the main idea behind diffusion. So small changes diffuses so that it affects a lot of the bits of the ciphertext. And confusion actually where the security lies by just looking at the ciphertext bits or bytes. They shouldn't provide any information about the plaintext. So let's talk about a few block ciphers, but before that we have to give the basic design methods. So block ciphers can mostly categorize in two groups. One of them is substitution permutation network, SPN, and the second one is phase-down network. A cipher mostly consists of repetition of a round R times. So instead of designing a very complex algorithm, we design a round which contains confusion and diffusion layers, and we repeat this round R many times, and the choice of R depends actually your design. And since we have a secret key, we have to find a way to use this key information and put it inside all of these rounds. So for this reason, we also have the designer of the block cipher also chooses or designs a key schedule algorithm. So instead of using the key directly in every round, a key schedule algorithm is used to generate round keys from the secret key. So let's first look at the first one, phase-down network. So it was introduced by Horst Feistel. A round function of a phase-down network consists of as follows: a round function and the swap operation. So ID is as follows. I will give a picture in a minute. The B-bit input is divided into two halves. Round function is applied to one half and the output is XORed to the other half. Then the places of these halves are swapped. The key material is used inside the round function. So let me try to draw a picture. I really drew this picture myself. So this is why it doesn't look so good. So assume that you have a plaintext here, and you actually divided your block, plaintext block, into two halves as left and right. So in a round, you take the right part and make it the left part of the next round. But also this right part is fed into the round function. We perform confusion and diffusion layers here. We also use the secret key material here and obtain an output. This output XORs with the left part, and the left part becomes the right part of the next round. So in each round, you are actually providing confusion and diffusion to the left part and repeating this process many times. At the end, you will obtain the ciphertext block, which would look like a random sequence. So I told you that we have the key, but you can use the key in each round directly, but most of the time we have seen in the literature that this causes some problems. Most of the time algorithm becomes easier to break. So instead of that, we use a key schedule algorithm which produces round keys, and you use that material here instead of the key directly. So this is an example for a basic phase-style network, but you can generalize this. So instead of dividing into two parts, you can divide the plaintext block into 4 or 8 parts and perform operation all of them. So you can copy this picture next to each other and obtain a different or a generalized phase-style network. The second one is substitution permutation network. A round of an SPN consists of 3 layers: key addition, substitution, and permutation. Key addition combines the key material with the plaintext. This is the place where you use your round key. Substitution provides confusion, and permutation layer provides diffusion. The most famous examples that we can give are AES, which is like the most used block cipher in the world, actually most used encryption algorithm in the world, so we will talk about it soon. Present is also ISS standard for lightweight cryptography, and we will also see the main idea behind it when we talk about lightweight cryptography. So the picture of SPN is something like this. Again, you have the key and key schedule and obtain the round keys. So you use your round key and the input, and you kind of combine them. This could be an easiest operation like the XOR operation, where you combine bit by bit, which is actually an addition operation modulo 2. Then you have your substitution layer, permutation layer, and add round key again. So this is a single round. You repeat this process, and at the end you obtain the ciphertext. So when the person obtains the ciphertext, if they know the key, they also perform the key schedule algorithm. This time they go from bottom to top, so they perform the inverse operation of all of these layers, permutation and substitutions, and obtain the plaintext block. So this is the main idea behind an SPN block cipher. So is there I mean, it is hard to say that one of them is better than the other. There are some pros and cons, and actually it might depend on the environment that you are going to use the encryption. So we cannot say that one of them is better than the other, but they have some pros and cons. For the phase-style processes are as follows. Encryption algorithm is identical to the decryption algorithm. Only the order of the round keys change. This is important. So for this reason, you don't need to implement the inverse of each layer, because encryption and decryption are kind of goes on the same way. If you go back to the picture, for instance, you have the ciphertext, you need to perform the decryption. So there's no need to go and from the other side of the round function and go here, because the person who receives the ciphertext have this left and right part. So just by taking this right part and feeding it into the round function, they can obtain here, perform the XOR operation, and go up. So you don't need the inverse of the round function. But in the SPN, this is not the case, since you have to go back. You have to apply the inverse of permutation operation. For instance, if your permutation is obtained by a matrix multiplication, then in the decryption part, you also need the inverse of the matrix. So this is why it might not be a good idea to use SPN when you have limited area and putting each function consumes more space. But pros of SPN is as follows. A single round affects the whole input because you perform the diffusion and confusion layer on the whole input. So for the cons are actually complement of these definitions. For the phase style, a single round only affects half of the input, so the diffusion and confusion might take more rounds to show themselves. And for the SPN con, a con is as follows. Decryption procedure requires the inverses of the substitution and permutation layers. So again, this might increase the code size, or also it might increase the area that is required on a hardware to implement these algorithms. So another design consideration is the platform that you are going to use this algorithm, because depending on whether you are going to use them on a hardware or software changes a lot of design principles, because hardware implementations can easily work on bits, because you define the gates as logical operations on bits. But since most programming languages focus on bytes, bit operations are more costly on software. Just think about your favorite programming language. You can directly perform operations on bytes or bigger data structures like integers of 32-bit or 64-bit unsigned integers. But for instance, trying to access the 7th bit of a 64-bit integer, you have to shift that bit and perform an AND operation and so on. So it is not that easy to perform operations on every bit. So this is why if you design an algorithm that is fast on a hardware which works on bits, might be slow on software. So cipher design also determines the number of gates required to perform encryption on hardware. So number of gates determine the area required. So this is why you have to take into account if you are going to implement the algorithm on a hardware or the software. Moreover, code size or required memory is not a big problem for software implementations due to fast CPUs and large RAM. But today, with the Internet of Things, we have very small devices for computing, and they have very small memory and very slow CPU. So you have to think about the code size or the latency or the throughput of these algorithms, which we are going to talk about also in the topic of lightweight cryptography. Another thing is the security versus speed. Speed is generally measured as throughput. Adding more security measures, for instance, increasing the number of rounds or increases the security but reduces the speed. Ciphers performing well on hardware or software may not be suitable for constrained devices like RFID systems or sensor networks due to limited memory, battery, or computational power. Hence, we also need lightweight ciphers for very special devices or very special occasions. So it is hard to have a cipher to meet every expectation. Let's look at some of the standardized block ciphers. For the NIST, actually, currently we have only AES, Advanced Encryption Standard, which is most probably will be a standard for a very long time. Triple DES algorithm, it is also referred to as triple data encryption algorithm. Triple DES is valid as a NIST standard until 2024. So there is only a few years left to use this. Skipjack is no longer supported because it has a secret key of 80-bit key, and NIST doesn't allow a security less than 112 bits. So for only legacy use, skipjack is a standard. But for the ISO part, we have more ciphers. For the block ciphers, we have triple DES, MISTY 1, CAS 128, HIDE, AES, Camellia, and SEED. And for the case of lightweight cryptographic block ciphers, we have two standards, Present and Clefia. And actually, last year, they added LIA to here. So there are actually three lightweight block cipher standards here. So actually, I should update this slide. So these ciphers, as far as I know, all are free. There are no patents, so you can use any of them you want. But HIDE is theoretically broken, which I don't recommend. And I don't recommend any cipher with 80-bit key. So you should choose accordingly. But when you have AES and if it meets your performance expectations in the environment that you are going to use, there is no need to consider any other algorithm, actually, in my opinion, of course. So you might ask that how many runs a cipher should have, because there is no direct answer to this. The common belief is that increasing the number of runs increases the security. However, it will decrease the performance. So you have to find an optimum point where it provides both security and performance. And the common practice in design is as follows. Designers apply every known cryptanalysis techniques, and if they can break n runs, then they choose the run number r as r greater than equal to 2n to stay on the safe side. Because attacks always get better and better, people find new cryptanalysis techniques, people observe new weaknesses in the cipher and so on, so they attack more runs day by day. So if you choose the number of runs in a good way, even if people come up with better attacks, your cipher will still stay safe. So let's finalize this topic by thinking some of the problems. As you can see, for the symmetric key cryptography, the communicating people or devices should have the same secret key. So this introduces the problem of key management, because both of the parties should have this secret key that are exchanged through a secure channel. So keys must be exchanged between communicating parties before they can use the block cipher. But if you're trying to communicate with a lot of people, for instance, to communicate n people, one has to securely exchange n keys. So this applies for everybody. So imagine every device connected to the internet. If you try to exchange a secret key and go meet them in person and give the key, is not practically possible. So the solution for this is the use of public key encryption algorithms, but RSA or Algomal are much slower than these block ciphers. And they also introduce some bandwidth issues, because the data you are going to encrypt will have larger size when it's turned into a ciphertext. An easier solution, which actually most of the time we use on the internet, use key exchange algorithms like Diffie-Hellman key exchange to exchange your AES key and then use AES instead. Second problem is the key storage. Storing keys directly on the hard drive or RAM can be a problem. This is still a problem. It applies to almost every application of cryptography, even for cryptocurrencies. You have to store your keys in a good way. There are some solutions, but we cannot actually give a perfect solution for every case. Another problem of symmetric key crypto systems, also in the case of block ciphers, is message length hiding. Plain text and corresponding ciphertext lengths are identical. This is a good thing, but this also might leak some information, because if the adversary knows the context of the communication, then they can guess the plain text just by the ciphertext length. An example is as follows. For instance, some websites encrypt the forms filled by the users, but the remaining parts sent unencrypted. An example from a medical form can be like this, a question like, did you ever have a surgery? If yes, provide details. So if the user's answer to this question, if the answer provides a short ciphertext, namely a single block, then the person who captures the ciphertext and sees that it is short can realize that the answer to that question was no. But if it is a long one, since when you say yes, you also provide some details, the person who is listening to communication can understand that you answered the question as yes. So we have to keep that in mind. And if the message length can leak some information, we have to provide some countermeasures for that. Easiest thing to do is to add random bits to the plain text before encryption to hide the message length. But of course, this solution causes more data to be transmitted. We did a work years ago on this topic, and you can check adding how many bits provides how much security from that paper that we written like 10 years ago. Finally, the problem of key generation. As you can see, I always mentioned that we have a secret key like 128 bits, but as users, we almost never generate our keys. Our computers most of the time do it by themselves, but they have to be generated randomly. If this random generation process is not secure, then there's not a point of using a secure block cipher if your secret key generation is not secure. So in order to solve this problem, you can use cryptographically secure random number generators. And secondly, you can use password-based key derivation algorithm. So you choose a strong password, and your password is turned into bits by applying a hash function a lot of times, and that result is used as a secret key. Actually, this is probably you have done this if you use RAR compression algorithm, but with a password. So there your password is turned into AES key, and then it is used to encrypt your files while they are compressed. So these are the things we have to keep in mind when we are using block ciphers.